Bruchim Aboyim. We are now in the second part of the lecture. We are on the fifth book of the Torah, the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim. Excuse me, you're up to the fourth portion, the Seder of Reeh. And we're up to chapter 12, verse number 8. Again, Moshe is telling the people about what will happen, what they should do when they enter the land. This whole book is what Moshe told the people, again, 36 days before he died. This was his parting words, so to speak. This is called Mishnah Torah, a review of the Torah. He goes over, again, things that he taught them through the 40 years. So in verse number 8, he tells them, Lo sasun kol shanaknu oshim po hayom. Do not do, after all, what you have done like you've done here today. And Rashi tells, what does that mean? So Rashi tells us this means, this verse refers to the verse above where it says, when you shall pass over the Jordan, as I mentioned. He's telling them what they will do when they come into the land. So Rashi says, Moshe says, when you shall cross the Jordan, you are immediately permitted to sacrifice upon temporary altars all of the 14 years of the conquest and division of the land. It took them 7 years militarily to take over the land, 7 years to divide it. But upon these altars you may not offer all that you offer here this day in the tabernacle, which is with you, and has been anointed and is richly fit to offer upon. Again, this means sin offerings and guilt offering, vows and free will offerings. Again, there were many types of different offerings. But upon temporary altars, there may be offered only a vow and a free will offering. That's it. And that's the meaning of every man, whoever is right in his eyes, vows and free will offerings which you offer, because it is right in your al yadei sheyosh beinechem, and not because of an obligation. These you may offer upon temporary altars. Again, so there were bummas, people had private altars during certain times in Jewish history. Other than that, they were brought at the tabernacle, either at Shiloh and other places, or at the two temples in Jerusalem. So when it talks about Lo Sasun, you should not do, so Rabbeinu Bachai tells us that during the 14 years of the conquest, private altars were permitted, but not while they were in the desert and the Mishkan was so accessible. We even see that when Shmuel came to anoint a king, that they brought a sacrifice, a shlomim, a peace offering, that would be allowed to be brought. This is called a yosher b'einai, everything that's proper. So what does that mean? That until the Mishkan had been erected, the tabernacle, all the various sacrifices of sheep and cattle had to be of the category of what we call a shlomim, a peace offering. It's very interesting. The peace offering is called a peace offering. There was a chatos, a sin offering, and a guilt offering, and a burnt offering. The peace offering was called a peace offering because everyone, it's kind of cute, everyone got a piece. Again, it's a different word, but it does fit in this context because the most sacrifice for example, in Ola, everything was given to God, the whole animal was burnt, except for the hide, which was given to the priest. For something like a chatos, a sin offering, then the foreleg and the chest were given to the Kohen, and the rest was burnt on the altar. Again, with all sacrifices, blood and fats were burnt and put on the altar, either burnt and or sprinkled. In fact, if the Kohen did not eat from the sin offering, the person would not be forgiven for their sin. But the shlomim was different. The peace offering was brought, and the majority of the meat was given to the owner of the sacrifice. The priests would take their portion, again, of the foreleg and of the chest. And the inners and the fats would be burnt on the altar, and the blood would be sprinkled on the side of the altar. So God received his, the Kohanim, the priests received theirs, and the people the man who brought the offering would also receive theirs. But it was called something called Kachim Kalim, a minor sanctity. By that I mean that it had to be eaten only within the walls of Jerusalem. Something that was kachim kalim, something was a more severe form of sanctity, would only be eaten by the priest, and again within the walls of the sanctuary. So this would be the difference between the two. So it says that they would have offered them wherever they wanted before, again because of the shlama, the peace offering, which would have less sanctity to it. So if someone was not interested, though, in eating meat, he was never obligated to offer an animal sacrifice at all. And there was no restrictions as to where it had to be eaten outside, once the temple, outside the temple, before the temple was made. Since the Torah did not make one site holier than the other. And so Ish, Kol, Ra, Ayosha Be'eno. So everybody did, again, what was proper in their eyes. And that's what the verse is telling us. Continues in verse number 9. Because you've not come yet to rest and to the inheritance, which the Lord your God, again, as I've mentioned many times, both names of God, of kindness, of mercy, and of severity, whichever way God is always our Father and always treats us with love. No saying law giving to you is present tense. God constantly gives us every second of every day. Without God's overseeing us, without God's protection, we wouldn't exist. So what does it mean until you come now? You have not come yet, rather. God, nation of Israel did not know where the place of the temple would be until they entered the land of Israel. And so the holiness was not yet revealed based on Turi Torah. But the word hamenucha, for the rest, so Rashi tells us, this alludes to Shiloh. Again, when the Jews entered the land, they erected a tabernacle at Shiloh that stood for 369 years until it was destroyed by the Philistines. Hanachla, the word inheritance, Rashi tells, Zu Yerushalayim. This refers to Jerusalem. An interesting side fact of interest, Jerusalem is made up of two words, Yeru and Shalom. We have a tradition that the mountaintop where the temple stands is the place where Yitzchak, our father, was brought up as a sacrifice by Abraham, by Avram. And it says Hashem Yira, that he saw God there. But then we know that Shem, who was Malki Tzedek, who became the first priest, so to speak, where he called the place Shalom, or Salem. So if you put the two words, since these two great people both named it, but different names, so you have Yireh and Shalem, together Yerushalayim, and that's where the word Yerushalayim comes from. So we have, again, but it was not known that this would be the place. Now the Mishkan at Shiloh was greater than the second temple, which is interesting, since it contained 5 elements missing in the second temple. And that is why it's called, again, Menucha. The 5 things were, again, the Shekhinah, the divinity of God. Let's see if I remember all 5. Divinity of God, the Ark, the divinity of God. Naturally, I won't remember them all. The Shekhinah, divinity of God. It's not going to come quickly, so I'm not going to push myself. But anyways, there were 5 things that did not exist in the second temple that did exist in the first, and in the Mishkan at Shiloh. Now, Shiloh has a gematria of 345, which is the same as Moshe. Again, the Zohar says, we have a connection between the two. Again, we know that the Mishkan, we'll talk about it in a minute, about it having a temporary roof. That'll be brought up in a second. Now, Rashi calls Shiloh a resting place and Yerushalayim as an inheritance. Yet the Mishnah in Megillah states that the only difference between Shiloh, the Mishkan in Shiloh, and the temple in Jerusalem was that they ate kachim kalim, as I mentioned, kachim kalim being this peace offering, and meiser sheni, the second tithing which a farmer would bring of his produce to the temple site, in any place from which Shiloh was visible. But once the temple was made in Jerusalem, the only place it could be eaten was in the walls of Jerusalem. Again, this minor sanctity. Now this seems to imply that Shiloh had a higher degree of sanctity than Jerusalem. Since they were permitted, the area for eating, it was much larger. I guess any place you could see it, and you can see from a distance. So our usual understanding, however, is that Jerusalem and the temple there had a higher level of sanctity. So why then does the Mishnah imply that Shiloh had a greater level of holiness? It is a well-known fact in Jewish thought that it divides the physical world into 4 categories, each with a greater level of spirituality. the one below it. What does that mean? So the lowest level is what we call dome, inanimate. That would include stone, wood, things without any life to them. Even though according to the Rizal, everything has a soul, even a rock. Above this is someach, the plant world, things that grow, again, which lives off of the dome, again, coming from the ground, and is more advanced than it. Next is what we call chai, the animal kingdom, which is still on a higher existence. And on top of this is what we call the medaber, the speaker, referring to man, whose members have the greatest capacity of spirituality, the ability to communicate, the ability to speak. As we advance from the desert Mishkan to the temple, the amount of low-level materials increases, and the Mishkan contained very little inanimate material. Then in Shiloh, there was more stone, but no wood was used. And finally, in the temple, no animal materials were used at all. It is evident that the Mishkan at Shiloh was a more physical entity than the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the desert, since it contained coarser, less spiritual materials. And the temple was even more physical than the Mishkan and the tabernacle in the desert and in Shiloh, since it was made entirely out of stone and wood. So, as the name Mishkan indicates, the aim was for the Shekhinah, the divinity of God, to permeate every aspect of creation, whether human, animal, plant, or even the inanimate. This needed to be achieved in stages. Now, it's easier for man to infuse the animal world with holiness and to appreciate its spirituality than it is to do so with that which comprises the lower orders. This is because the animal world is closer to us than the plant or inanimate worlds, just one step from our own experience. So at first the Mishkan was made of wood and wool, but very little metal. And this reflected the nation Israel's limited ability at this stage in their history to attach holiness to the rest of the world. This progressed to a Mishkan made of stone and wool at Shiloh. Finally, the temple symbolized the pinnacle of achievement, the ability to imbue the whole of creation, even the lowest orders of existence, with spiritual holiness. So it was built from stone with a wooden roof, indicating that the nation could see holiness in even plants and stones. At this stage, the Shekhinah rested in every corner of creation. This explains why only the temple may be described as an inheritance. This implies permanency, something fixed and unchanging, since only when the temple was constructed could the real and final purpose of God's house be said to have been achieved. In this respect, the temple was definitely far greater than its predecessors, the Mishkan at Shiloh and that in the desert. The fact that the Mishkan at Shiloh was less holy than Yerushalayim was evident in the fact that it was made of stone and animal wool. The holier the entity, the more private and restricted it is. As such, the sanctity of Shiloh was weaker and therefore less restricted than the temple and again Jerusalem. Offerings then could be eaten anywhere in its locale based on a Shem Yishmuel. And it continues it says that Al Menucha, Shiloh was no longer a tent as it was in the desert, but a stone building. Since the nation of Israel had entered the land of Israel and were no longer wanderers, but to signify that Shiloh was not the permanent residence, house of God, they made the roof out of the curtains that were used in the Mishkan. But why didn't they use the gold-plated planks and silver sockets of the Mishkan, again, which were much more expensive, much more costly? So it says that the curtains were handmade by the righteous women of that generation and were very precious in the eyes of God, whereas the planks were made by the gold that was donated by the men, who also donated generously for the making of the golden calf, based on his name, the Torah. And it continues in verse number 10. When you pass the Jordan, and dwell in the land which the Lord your God has caused you to inherit, and he'll give to you rest from all of your enemies, that are around you, and you will dwell in safety. So what does it mean, peace? Peace, the first mention is peace is a external peace, again from outside forces, and you'll dwell in safety, again, is talking about internal peace. They shall not fight among yourselves, something that we've had problems with throughout our existence. And it continues in verse number 11, V'hoyen bi hamakom, the place asher yivkar Hashem Elokeichem bo l'shakim l'sham, that God will choose to put His name there. Shama teviu, there you shall bring, as kol asher anoki mitzvah eschem, everything which I command you. Now the word v'hoya always is something that alludes to something happy, and again, we'll be thrilled when this is the case. Rashi says, build unto yourself the temple in Jerusalem, and thus it states regarding David HaMelech in the book of Shmuel, and it came to pass when the king dwelt in his house, and God had given him rest from all his enemies around, and the king said to Nasan the prophet, see now I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells within curtains. And it says, Shema Taviu, they'll bring you there. And above it states with reference to Shiloh, Rashi says. And here it's stated in reference to Jerusalem. For this reason, the Torah writes them separately, in order to give permission to offer, again, these private altars between one and the other. From the destruction of Shiloh, again, as I told you, that was after 369 years, and the temple was not built for another 50 years, I believe, until they came to Nob, from the destruction of Nob, until they came to Givon. Again, the temporary altars permitted until they came to Jerusalem. Once they came to Jerusalem, private altars were no longer allowed. Again, there was a fear that people would not bother coming 3 times again to the temple during the year to see God, but they would be much easier to do it, walk out your backyard or to the city. And it continues, and it says in the verse, Es Asher, Kol Asher Anoki Mitzvah Eskem, everything which I command you. Olosechem, again, your burnt offerings, Zivcheim, and your sacrifices, including all different ones. Masrosechem, your tithings. Utrumas Yedchem, and the offerings of your hand. V'chomivchar Divrechem, and all your choice vows. Asher Tidru Hashem, which you vow to the Lord your God. Rashi says, what do you mean, your choice vows? It teaches that one should bring the choices to God. Again, it's amazing when you stop and think about that people, it was expensive to do these things, and yet people didn't hesitate. You could not bring something that was inferior. It had to be perfect and the best of what you have. Again, this is how we serve God, only with the best. We do the same now. What's called hiddur mitzvah, the beauty of a mitzvah, to make sure you have the nicest talit that you could have, nicest pair of tefillin that you could have. Again, seder plates, everything that we do for a mitzvah. Even the way you look on the Shabbat and the holidays should be, again, a compliment to God and a sign of being the best that we have. And it continues, and it says in verse number 12, very important, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God. Again, part of being happy. Happiness is a mitzvah. That we are required by God to be happy, not to... it's very strange. People use the term, it's schwer zu sein a Yid. It's a Jewish term, which means it's difficult to be Jewish. It's really not a proper thing to say. There's so much benefits, there's so much joy, and a person needs to see the joy and beauty to it. And continues, and it says, that you and your son and your daughter and your servant, male servants and female servants, also Levi Asher b'sharechem, and also the priest, the Levi, the Levite, who is at your gate. Ki ein lo chelek v'nach le'ikum, as the Levi does not have a portion or an inheritance with you. Now, why would the Levi be happy if he has no portion in the land? It's interesting how you can look at something from 2 different ways and come up with something totally 2 different opposites. So because what he's saying here is our Torah, because his portion, the Levi's portion, is really planted and harvested by the Israelite without him working the land. His work is directed only to God. So in a sense, which is very cute, because they say the Levites and the Kohanim didn't have a part in the land. In reality, maybe they had the whole land. And the Jew who worked the land, the simple Israelite, was really a sharecropper. And he worked the land. He had to do all the hard back-breaking work. And then when the product was finished, then he would give to the Kohen and the Levi their portion. Again, so it would seem, on one way to look at it, is that the whole thing belonged to the Levium, and it was just the Israelites that were the sharecroppers. We also see that the Levite is connected to all the other members of your household, because it mentions your son, your daughter, your maid, manservant, your female servant, and that in a sense, the Levites were also the teachers, the sages. So that one should look at a Talmud Chacham, a teacher, a sage, and he should be welcome at your table as family, not as a guest. You should make him feel like he belongs, based on the base Mordechai. And it continues in verse number 13, Yeshamalecha, guard yourself, pen tala li should go up and offer losach your burnt offering, mechol mokum asher tira, in any place that you see. Rashi says, what does that mean, that you see? Asher yal livchacha, that where you will enter your heart, that you may offer by the commandment of a prophet like Eliyahu, but you may offer by the commandment of a prophet like Eliyahu on Mount Carmel. So what the verse is telling us is that you cannot bring a sacrifice any place you want. It has to be only in the temples. On the other hand, we see that Eliyahu Navi did bring a sacrifice outside the temple on Har Carmel, when he had the contest, so to speak, with the prophets, the idol prophets of the Baal. So as something, Torah cannot be changed, but a Navi can do something lifi shah, just on a very temporary basis, but not permanently. You cannot change the Torah. The Torah is permanent. Now, the reason that the verse is so stringent with regards to the prohibition of other altars once the temple is built is because the altars cause the nation of Israel, to refrain from ascending to Jerusalem on the festivals of Passover, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, and offering their sacrifices there. Once they started offering their sacrifice and incense on other altars, they would begin to offer them to golden calves, again in Dun and Beisel, based on Achizkuni. When a person would go to the temple, there were 10 miracles that went on all the time. So when a person would go there, in fact, one of them was, you had millions of people that came to the temple. The temple was not large enough to accommodate them all, and yet it did. But they were really packed like sardines. They were really packed close to each other. Much like if you ever had the honor and privilege to be at 770 with the Lubavitcher Rebbe when he was alive, Alav Shalom. The Hasidim were packed together like sardines. What was amazing is when the Lubavitcher Rebbe would enter, he would split the sea, so to speak, and all of a sudden there was room for him to walk through where there was not an inch of room before he came. But the greater miracle was in the temple, because when the people were part of the service was they had to prostrate themselves, which means they would lay themselves out on the ground of the temple, on the floor. Here, they did not have enough room to stand, yet they somehow had enough room to prostrate themselves. How was that possible? So we believe there was a great miracle that they were transported to the temple. We believe that there's a temple directly above the temple on earth, and that's a reflection. A temple on earth is a reflection of the temple in heaven. So for that moment, they were moved up to heaven and were able to find, because in heaven, space and time do not exist. Again, so there were many miracles that were seen there. And for people to see them again, it would reinforce their belief and strength of service to God. In verse 14, verse 14, let's continue. But only in the place which God will choose, not you, God will choose. In one of your tribes, Sham Taleh Alosecha, there you will bring up your burnt offerings, V'sham Taseh Kol Asher Anokim Etzaveka, and there you will do all that I command you. What does it mean, one of your tribes? So actually, we know that the temple was actually in two tribes. Rashi mentions that it was in the portion of Binyamin. Really, the main body of the temple was in the portion of Yehuda. But Yehuda and Binyamin were bordered on each other. So the temple, the main part of the temple, was constructed in the portion of Yehuda. And the Holy of Holies was in the portion of Binyamin, which was the holiest site on earth. So it says Bechelka Binyamin, it was in the portion of Yamin, as it says all of your tribes. So how is it possible if it was in the portion of Benjamin, Binyamin? So when David HaMelech purchased the threshing floor from Aravna Hayavusi, he collected the gold from all the tribes, and he took 50 shekel from each one of the tribes, paid 600 shekel to Arabna Yavusi, and it was bought and again given to all of them. Nevertheless, the threshing floor was in a portion of Binyamin, again as far as the basic overall land that was there. Now, when it says Sham Tale Ola Secha, if you take the first letter of these three words, spells the word Tesha, which is 9, and this alludes to 9 things that were brought up there. Again, Ola, a burnt offering, Chatos, a sin offering, Asham, a guilt offering, Shlomim, a peace offering. These were all animal offerings. They were all, again, they would have a meal offering and wine that would go with them, but they were basically, the main offering was an animal. But then you had a mincha, a meal offering, generally brought by a poor person. Then you had shemen, oil, lavona, frankincense, yayin, wine, and mayim, water. Okay, these 9 things were brought up. Now, continues in verse number 15, Rak, b'chol avos nafshecha, notwithstanding all the desires of your soul, tizbak, you may slaughter, v'chalta basar, and eat meat, give baruch Hashem lokecha, as the blessing, Lord your God, Hashem nasan which is given you, b'chol sharecha, in all of your gates. Now, Rashi here tells us that, what is this talking about? It's regarding no consecrated animals in which there occurred a blemish, that they may be redeemed and eaten in any place. Again, an animal, in order to be sacrificed on the altar, had to be perfect. We see a comparison to this. We know on the Shabbat, we have what's called lechem mishnah. We use two breads, 2 rolls, to make our blessing on bread with. But it has to be two rolls. Again, we say because on Friday, 2 portions of mun would fall in the desert. And to commemorate that, we on Shabbat have 2 loaves of bread that we keep as a symbolic remembrance of that. If you've ever been to a fair, many times they'll have a challah that's huge. And they'll make hamotzi on it, and then they'll cut it up and give it to people as part of the hamotzi. What if you have 2 small rolls, and you have half of this big challah? So what should you use? I mean, the half of the big challah is probably at least 5 to 10 times more than 2 rolls together. And yet, the head should be perfect. Better use 2 perfect rolls than that big challah in 1 roll. Because again, perfection is what it's about. We do not force feed an animal. When they would bring an animal for a sacrifice for idols, they would force feed them. Big, fat. Not in Judaism. The important thing is perfect, without a blemish. That is what was brought. So again, even if it had a blemish, then you could eat it, but it could not be brought on the altar. Again, it would have to be redeemed. So the Torah tells the tizbak v'yachalta, that you can eat it. Ein lacha bahem. You have no regarding it permission to use their wool or meat, only eating through slaughtering. So that would be the only thing you'd be able to do. Now, because the desires of your soul, the Alshlik says that eating should be done to elevate the soul, avos nafshecha, the desire of your soul, not to indulge the body. Again, there's a saying in English, a person should eat to live, not live to eat. We as Jews, on the other hand, no, that's not the case. Now, the entire sum realized from the first animal must be reinvested. So again, what you're going to do is you're going to redeem the first animal, but all the money that get received from that redemption has to be used to buy another animal, so that the substitute can be considered as corresponding in full measure to the will expressed by the owner of the original animal when he sanctified it to be an offering on the altar. An appropriate translation of these words would be then, by means of a complete transfer of your original intention, based on Aksav Kabbalah. And it continues in the verse, and it says, Hatame v'atar yachlena, that which is unclean and clean you shall eat, katzvi v'ka'ayo, like the deer and like the hart. Now Rashi here tells we mean the clean and the unclean. Since they consecrated animals that had begun blemish were formerly consecrated animals, even when it originally was set aside as a sacrifice, regarding which it says in the flesh that touches anything unclean shall not be eaten. It was necessary to grant permission for this, that the unclean and clean may be eaten in one dish, as the gazelle and the hart, for no offering can be brought from them. So since that's the case, you could eat them with anything, and that was the point, because once something is sanctified, you could not. So that's a distinction. And that's why it says like the deer and like the heart. To exempt them from giving them to priests, again, the shoulder, the stomach, the cheeks and the stomach, again, gifts that were given to the Kohen from any sacrifice. But since there are 10 kosher animals, among them are deer and heart, excuse, one of them is a giraffe, try to figure out where to slaughter that. But the 3 that are domesticated are the ox family, goats and sheep. And anytime those would be sacrificed, again, that the gifts would have to be given to the priests. In verse number 16, Rakadam lo sochelu, important commandment, you cannot eat the blood. Allah or chishpachena kamayim, you should pour it on the ground like water. Now Rashi here tells us that afapisha, even though I have said that you must not sprinkle this blood upon the altar because it is blemished, but still, whether it's a sanctified animal or not, we have a commandment not to eat blood. Again, we say dam hu nefesh, that the blood is the soul, and we do not eat it. Again, you should pour it like water. Rashi says to inform it that it does not require covering. It is like water and making grain fit for, again, priestly blessing. Now, that would be the difference between a bird and or a non-domesticated animal, that they do have to be covered. A domesticated animal just these pour the blood, but you do not have to cover it. Kamayim, so as I mean, probably first tishbacheni, you should pour it. It's exempt, again, as we mentioned, from covering the blood. In fact, the gematria of tishbachena is the same as pater milakasosa. It's exempt from covering it in Hebrew words. Also, the word shbachena is missing a yud, that this is what we call halacha Moshe misinai. We have Torah commandments that were stated directly in the Torah, and then we also have rabbinic laws that were learned out. Then we have a third category which has somewhat the same stringency as a Torahic commandment, and that we call Halakha Moshe Sinai. This was given to Moshe orally on Mount Sinai, which he passed on to the people. Now when it says in verse 17, continues, one more thing, Kamayim, like water. Once we redeem this animal for its meat, then it becomes permitted for use and benefit, even that which we can't eat, just like water. Continues in verse number 17, Lo suchal lecho b'sharecha ma'aser ganecha b'zirot yitzarecha, that you may not eat within your gates the tithing of your produce, or the wine, or the oil, or the firstling of your herd, chorsa b'karecha b'tzonecha, and your flocks, v'kol zerecha, your vows, your sidor, which you vowed, nosecha, and your freewill offerings, u'trumas yadecha, and the offerings of your hand. So Rashi explains, Lo suchal, you may not eat. By repeating the injunction, we place a positive command upon a negative command, which gives it a much stronger basis in halacha, in Jewish law. That was the meaning. Rabbi Shua ben Korcha said that Yochel Ata, you are able, but you are not permitted. As it says, the Uvites inhabits Yerushalayim, and the children of Israel could not drive them out. Why could they not drive them out? And it says, because they were not permitted, because Avraham Avinu had made a treaty, a covenant, with the Yevusim, when he purchased the Machpelah, when he purchased a cave to bury Sarah, and again we know that the forefathers are buried there. We're talking about Hebron, but they were Hittites, is what Rashi says. However, because the city whose name was Yevus, they were called Yevusites. Okay, so that's the reason why Arno Yevusi. That's where he got his title, so to speak. Now, lo tucha, you're not allowed. The same as lo yochal. You should not, to mean that violators' actions would be legally make them totally invalid. Again, so you cannot do this. In your gates, you have 3 prohibitions. One is eating, tithing outside of Jerusalem. Again, the Meiser Sheni had to be brought to Jerusalem and eaten within the walls. As I mentioned last time, to set up a kolo system of people learning and staying in Jerusalem. Jerusalem did not have an economy of its own. What gave it its economy was the fact that people came, and again, their Meiser that was there allowed the people to do business within the city. Also, the second thing is the Kohen is forbidden to eat an unblemished Bechor. The firstborn animal was given to the Kohen outside of the Jerusalem again. And also that an Israelite was forbidden to eat this in any location, again, the firstborn. Now, it says that Yachal, I would think, Aval Rishon Ge'etzabo, they are able, but you are not permitted. That those things which are not permitted should be seen by you as if you are not even able to do them. That even the thought would not enter your mind based on the Torah's Chaim. So they're totally prohibited. And again, it shouldn't even enter your mind that you might want to. And hopefully that would be the case. Rashi here tells us of Achoros B'charecha, the firstborn of your herd. So this is a forewarning to the priests, since the Israelites were not at all permitted to eat firstlings. So all this, again, was the firstborn was a gift. There were 24 gifts that were given to priests. This was one of them. Wow. Whew. Time flies when you're having a good time. I'm sorry, but I have to stop here, and we'll continue again next week. Again, God bless you and your family. Stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy. And again, God should bless you with all that is good. Thank you for attending. Shabbat Shalom.